A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Herman, I was looking at some footage recently of the Passover sacrifice on Mount Gerizim. It is this incredibly visceral ancient scene. Hundreds of people dressed in white, the smoke rising, the chanting in a language that sounds like it was pulled directly out of the Bronze Age. And it hit me that we are looking at a group of people who have essentially outlasted every empire that has ever tried to claim this land. We are recording this in March of 2026, and in just a few weeks, that mountain will once again be the site of a ritual that has remained virtually unchanged for over 2 millennia. It is the ultimate paradox, a population that has been on the brink of vanishing for centuries, yet refuses to actually disappear.
It is one of the most remarkable stories of cultural persistence in human history, corn. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way. And you are right, the Samaritans are a living anomaly. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt asking about them, and it is a perfect follow-up to some of our deep dives into linguistics and history. We are talking about a population that currently numbers around 950 people. In any other context, a group that small would have been assimilated or disappeared centuries ago. But the Samaritans are still here, standing on the same mountain they have called holy for over 2,500 years. They are a masterclass in what we might call survival engineering.
Survival engineering. I like that. It implies that their persistence is not just an accident of history, but the result of a very specific system architecture of identity. How does a tiny minority maintain that architecture when they are constantly buffeted by the winds of massive dominant cultures? Today we are going to look at the origins of the Samaritans, their incredible linguistic preservation, and how they navigate one of the most complex geopolitical landscapes on Earth. We are going to see how they have managed to be perceived as us by two groups, Israelis and Palestinians, who often view each other as the ultimate them.
Most people hear the word Samaritan and they think of the New Testament parable, the Good Samaritan. They think of it as a synonym for a helpful stranger. But the actual people, the Shamarim, which translates to the keepers or the guardians of the law, have a history that is parallel to and often in friction with mainstream Jewish history. They do not consider themselves a sect of Judaism. They consider themselves the true, original Israelites who never left the land. They are the legacy system of the Israelite tradition.
That is an important distinction to start with. In the Jewish tradition, the narrative is that after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722, before the Common Era, the local population was deported and replaced with foreigners who eventually adopted a form of the local religion. But the Samaritans tell a very different story. They say they are the direct descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who remained in the land and kept the original traditions while the Judeans went off to Babylon and came back with all sorts of foreign influences.
Right. And that divergence is where the technical details of their survival get really interesting. If you look at their religious practice, it is incredibly focused. They have one holy place, Mount Gerizim, which overlooks the city of Nablus. They have one text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and they have a lineage of high priests that they trace back to Aaron, the brother of Moses. By keeping the scope of their identity so tightly defined and tied to a specific geographic anchor, they created a very resilient, albeit very small, community. It is like an air-gapped computer system. By limiting the ports of entry for outside influence, they protected the core data.
I want to dig into that linguistic piece first, because that is where the visual evidence of their isolation is most striking. We did an episode, number 1031, where we talked about the evolution of the Hebrew script, how it moved from the ancient Paleo-Hebrew characters to the square Aramaic-style letters we see in modern Hebrew today. But the Samaritans never made that jump, did they?
When you look at a Samaritan scroll, it looks nothing like a modern Torah scroll. They still use the ancient Hebrew script, which is a derivative of the Phoenician alphabet. To a modern Hebrew speaker, it looks like a secret code or an alien language, but that script is actually the older version. When the Judeans returned from the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before the Common Era, they brought back the Aramaic square script, which was the lingua franca of the Persian Empire. It was a technological upgrade in a sense, making the text more readable across the region. But the Samaritans viewed that as a corruption of the sacred operating system.
It is like they refused to update their kernel. They stayed on the original version while everyone else moved to the new release. And because they stayed on that old script, it acted as a sort of cultural firewall. If you cannot read the neighbor's books and they cannot read yours, the rate of cultural exchange and assimilation drops significantly. It is a very effective way to prevent data rot in a culture.
That is a great way to put it. And it is not just the script, it is the language itself. Their liturgical Hebrew has a very different phonetic structure than the Hebrew used in Jewish prayer. It sounds more guttural, more archaic. For example, they do not use the V sound for the letter Wa, they use a B or a W sound. When they chant the Pentateuch, you are hearing a version of the language that has been preserved in a sort of stasis. It is a linguistic time capsule. And this connects back to what we discussed in episode 1044 about Ezra the scribe. In the Jewish tradition, Ezra is the hero who revitalized the law and standardized the text. But in the Samaritan tradition, Ezra is the villain, the one who changed the script and moved the center of worship to Jerusalem to consolidate power.
So you have these two groups who both claim the same foundation, the 5 books of Moses, but they are running different versions of the software. I have read that there are about 6,000 differences between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text used by Jews. Most are minor, like spelling variations or grammatical tweaks, but some are massive architectural differences, right?
Major ones. The most significant is the commandment regarding the place of worship. In the Samaritan version, the 10th commandment explicitly mentions building an altar on Mount Gerizim. For them, the holiness of Gerizim is baked into the original source code. For the Jews, the focus on Jerusalem came later, primarily during the time of King David and Solomon. So you have this fundamental disagreement over the central geography of the faith, and that disagreement has fueled over 2,500 years of separation. The Samaritans argue that the Jewish version was edited to justify the centralization of power in Jerusalem, while the Jews argue the Samaritans added the Gerizim bit later.
It is fascinating because it shows that survival often requires a certain level of stubbornness. If the Samaritans had been more flexible, if they had said, okay, Jerusalem is fine too, or let us use the square script to make trade easier, they probably would have been absorbed into the larger Jewish or later Christian or Muslim populations. Their survival is a direct result of their refusal to compromise on these specific markers of identity. But that stubbornness came at a massive cost.
It almost cost them everything. If we look at the historical numbers, during the Roman and Byzantine periods, there were hundreds of thousands of Samaritans. They were a major force in the region. But they suffered through a series of brutal revolts and subsequent massacres, especially under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. Then, under Islamic rule, there were further pressures to convert or face high taxes and social exclusion. By the early 20th century, the population had dwindled to fewer than 200 people. They were literally on the verge of biological collapse.
That is a terrifyingly small number. You are talking about a few dozen families. How do you even maintain a gene pool at that point? That seems like a biological dead end.
It was a crisis of endogamy marrying within the group. For centuries, they were so closed off that genetic diseases became a serious threat. But in the last 100 years, they have made some very pragmatic, almost radical adjustments. They have started allowing Samaritan men to marry women from outside the community, mostly from Eastern Europe, like Ukraine or Russia or other parts of the Middle East, provided the women convert and commit to the strict Samaritan way of life. This infusion of new genetic material, combined with modern genetic screening at places like Tel Hashomer Hospital in Israel, has led to a demographic rebound. They're up to about 950 people now. It is still tiny, but the trajectory is finally pointing upward.
It is a delicate balance. You want to preserve the ancient line, but you have to adapt to the biological reality of being a closed system. Now, Daniel's prompt also asked about where they live today and how they navigate the geopolitical mess of the region. Most people know they are here in the Holy Land, but is there a Samaritan diaspora? Do they have communities in New York, or London, or Paris?
This is one of the most unique things about them, corn. There is virtually no Samaritan diaspora. Unlike the Jewish people who spent 2,000 years spread across the globe, the Samaritans stayed anchored to their land. If you leave the land, you are essentially leaving the faith because so much of it is tied to the physical presence of Mount Gerizim. Today, the community is split almost exactly in half between two locations. One is Kiryat Luza, which is a village on top of Mount Gerizim, right next to the Palestinian city of Nablus. The other is a neighborhood in the city of Holon, just south of Tel Aviv.
So they are living in two completely different worlds. One group is in the heart of the West Bank, surrounded by Palestinian territory, and the other is in the heart of metropolitan Israel. That has to create an incredibly complex social dynamic. How do they handle having a foot in both camps?
It is a masterclass in neutrality. The Samaritans on Mount Gerizim speak Arabic as their first language. They go to schools in Nablus. They have historically had excellent relations with the Palestinian leadership. In fact, the late Yasser Arafat even reserved a seat for a Samaritan representative in the Palestinian Legislative Council. They are seen by many Palestinians as an indigenous, ancient part of the local fabric, a group that belongs to the land just as much as they do.
But at the same time, they are Israelites. They hold Israeli citizenship, they speak Hebrew, and the group in Holon is fully integrated into Israeli society. They serve in the military, they work in high tech, they are part of the Israeli mainstream.
They are the only group of people who routinely hold both Israeli and Palestinian identity documents. They can travel between Nablus and Tel Aviv in a way that almost no one else can. They act as a sort of human bridge. When tensions flare up between Israelis and Palestinians, the Samaritans often find themselves in the middle, literally and figuratively. Their strategy for survival has been to remain politically neutral. They do not take sides in the national conflict. They focus entirely on their community and their religious duties. They are the ultimate small world between two giants.
It is a precarious position, though. In a region where identity is often weaponized, being the bridge can sometimes mean getting stepped on by both sides. Have they managed to maintain that respect from both the Israeli and Palestinian authorities over the long term?
For the most part, yes. And a big reason for that is their small size. They are not a threat to anyone. They are not competing for land in a way that shifts the demographic balance significantly. They are seen as a living museum, a treasure that both sides want to claim a connection to. The Israelis see them as proof of the ancient Israelite presence in the land, and the Palestinians see them as proof of a local, non-Zionist indigenous population that has always been there. By being useful to both narratives, they have carved out a space of relative safety. It is a form of diplomatic immunity, granted by their own antiquity.
It is fascinating how they have leveraged their age as a shield. If you are ancient enough, you become part of the landscape rather than part of the conflict. But I imagine the logistics of daily life are still a nightmare. If you live in Kiryat Luza on the mountain, you are right next to an Israeli military outpost, but your neighbors are in Nablus. When there are closures or security incidents, how does that community function?
They have a very high level of internal cohesion. Because everyone knows everyone, they can coordinate and support each other through the disruptions. And the Israeli government has generally been very accommodating regarding their religious needs. For example, during the Passover sacrifice, which we mentioned at the start, thousands of people, including Israeli tourists and international observers, flock to Mount Gerizim. The security arrangements for that are massive and involve cooperation between the Israeli military and the local Samaritan leadership. It is one of the few times you see that kind of high-level coordination for a religious event in the West Bank.
Let us talk about that ritual for a second, because it is the most visible part of their identity to the outside world. To many modern people, the idea of an animal sacrifice is shocking, or even primitive. But for the Samaritans, it is a non-negotiable part of the biblical command.
It is the most literal interpretation of the text you can find. While the Jewish community replaced animal sacrifice with prayer after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 Common Era, the Samaritans never stopped. They do not believe the temple in Jerusalem was the legitimate place anyway, so they continue the practice exactly as it is described in the book of Exodus. They slaughter the lambs, they roast them in deep pits, they eat the meat in haste with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. It is a sensory explosion. The smell of the wood smoke, the sound of the chanting, the sight of the blood. It is a direct link to a 3,000-year-old practice. It is not a reenactment. For them, it is the actual fulfillment of a divine command.
It really highlights the difference in how the two groups handled the loss of sovereignty. The Jewish tradition evolved, it became portable. It developed the Talmud and a complex legal system that could function in the diaspora. The Samaritan tradition stayed fixed. It is a legacy system that never went through a major rewrite. And that brings us back to the idea of cultural survival. Is it better to be flexible and spread out, or to be rigid and anchored?
Well, the Jewish model clearly allowed for a much larger population and a global influence, but the Samaritan model has a different kind of strength. There is something deeply powerful about a community that can say, we are still here, on this exact spot, doing exactly what our ancestors did 2,500 years ago. They have outlasted the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and the British. Every single one of those empires is gone, and the Samaritans are still on Mount Gerizim.
It is a reminder that being small and focused can be a valid strategy for long-term persistence. If you are a huge empire, you have massive overhead, you have internal divisions, you are a target for every other rising power. If you are a small, tightly knit community with a clear sense of purpose and a refusal to be assimilated, you can slip through the cracks of history. It is like the difference between a massive mainframe and a specialized hardened microcontroller.
And you know, there is a modern tech analogy here too. We often talk about how the most secure systems are the ones that are air-gapped or running on very specific non-standard protocols. The Samaritans are essentially an air-gapped culture. By maintaining their own script, their own pronunciation, and their own geographic center, they made it very difficult for outside cultural viruses to infect their system. They are running on a proprietary OS that no one else has the source code for.
But they are not totally isolated anymore. You mentioned they use the internet. They have cell phones. They work in modern offices in Tel Aviv or Nablus. How does that modern connectivity affect this ancient air gap? Can a group of fewer than 1,000 people survive the sheer pressure of globalized culture in 2026?
That is the big question for the 21st century. The younger generation of Samaritans is much more connected than their parents were. They are on social media. They are exposed to the same global trends as everyone else. There is a real tension between the desire to be a modern person and the obligation to be a guardian of an ancient tradition. But so far, the community has been very successful at integrating technology without losing their core identity. They use apps to help teach the ancient script to their children. They use genetic screening to manage their population growth. They are using the tools of the future to preserve the past. They are not Luddites, they are preservationists.
It is a fascinating hybrid. And I think there is a lesson there for anyone interested in preserving any kind of identity or tradition. It is not about rejecting the new. It is about being very intentional about what you let in and how you use it. The Samaritans have been doing this for 2.5 millennia. They are the professionals at this.
They really are. And I think their role as a neutral party in the Israeli-Palestinian context is something that deserves more attention. In a conflict that is so often defined by binary choices, the Samaritans represent a third way. They are Israelites who are not Jews. They are residents of the West Bank who are not Palestinians. They challenge the neat categories that we like to put people in. They are a living reminder that the history of this land is far more complex than the modern political narratives suggest.
It makes me think about our episode on Zoroastrianism, number 680. That is another ancient group that has survived against incredible odds, but they are much more spread out now. The Samaritans have that physical anchor that the Zoroastrians largely lost. Does that make the Samaritans more or less vulnerable?
It is a trade-off. The anchor provides a center of gravity that keeps the community together. You do not have to worry about the Samaritans losing their way because the mountain is always there. But it also means that if something catastrophic happens in that one specific location, the entire culture is at risk. They have all their eggs in one very ancient basket. If Mount Gerizim were to become inaccessible, the Samaritan religion, in its current form, would essentially cease to function.
That is the risk of the local versus the distributed, but given their track record, I would not bet against them. They have seen it all before, and they have a sense of time that is very different from ours. When we talk about current events, we are looking at weeks or months. When the Samaritans look at current events, they are looking at it through the lens of centuries.
I remember hearing an interview with a Samaritan priest who was asked about the current political situation. He basically said, "We have seen empires come and go. We have seen wars start and end. This too shall pass, and we will still be here." That kind of perspective is incredibly grounding. It is something we could all use a little more of in our hyper-reactive modern world.
So, for our listeners who want to dive deeper into this, I really recommend looking into the linguistic side of things. If you have not listened to episode 1031 on the evolution of Hebrew, go back and do that. It will give you the context you need to really appreciate why the Samaritan script is such a big deal. And episode 1044 on Ezra the Scribe provides the other side of the historical schism. It is like looking at two different branches of a software fork.
And if you are ever in the region, try to visit the Samaritan Museum on Mount Gerizim. It is a small, family-run place, but the artifacts and the passion they have for their history are incredible. You can see the ancient scrolls, you can see the maps of their historical villages, and you can get a sense of the sheer weight of time that they carry. It is one thing to read about it. It is another thing to stand on that mountain and realize you are standing on a site of continuous worship that predates the Roman Empire.
It is a reminder that history is not just something in books, it is something people are living every day. The Samaritans are not a museum piece, they are a vibrant, evolving, and very determined community. They are proof that even a tiny minority can hold its own against the tides of history if they have a strong enough foundation.
And a lot of stubbornness. Do not forget the stubbornness. It is the essential ingredient in any long-term survival strategy. You have to be willing to say no to the world for a very long time.
Truly. Well, this has been a fascinating look into a group that most people only know from a name in a parable. I want to thank Daniel for sending us this prompt. It gave us a chance to connect a lot of the threads we have been pulling on over the last few hundred episodes.
Yeah, it is a great example of how these weird prompts can lead to some really deep insights. If you are enjoying the show and the way we dig into these topics, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation.
It really does. We see all the feedback, and we appreciate it. You can find our entire archive of over 1,000 episodes at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have got search tools there, so you can find all our previous discussions on linguistics, history, and geopolitics.
And if you have a topic you want us to explore, or if you have a question about something we discussed today, there is a contact form on the website. We love hearing from you guys.
We will be back next time with another exploration into the weird and wonderful corners of human knowledge. Until then, keep asking those deep questions.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. Thanks for listening, everyone. We will talk to you soon.
Take care, everyone.
You know, Herman, I was just thinking about that point you made about the Samaritans being a living museum. It is a bit of a double-edged sword, is it not? On one hand, it gives them this protected status, but on the other, it can feel like they are being frozen in time by the expectations of outsiders.
That is a very astute observation, Corn. There is a real pressure on them to perform their ancientness for tourists and scholars. People come to see the sacrifice or the ancient scrolls, and they expect to see something out of a history book. But the Samaritans are modern people. They have to navigate that gap between the image the world has of them and the reality of their daily lives. They use iPhones, they drive cars, they deal with the same modern stresses we all do.
Right. Like the young Samaritan woman who wants to be a high-tech entrepreneur in Tel Aviv, but also has to maintain all the strict purity laws of her community. For example, I have read that they still follow very strict laws regarding menstruation and childbirth total isolation for a set number of days. That is a massive amount of cognitive load to carry in a modern professional environment. But maybe that is exactly what has kept them sharp. You cannot just coast when your identity requires that much active maintenance.
It is the opposite of passive identity. For most people, their culture is like the air they breathe. They do not even think about it. For a Samaritan, identity is a conscious choice they have to make every single day. They have to decide to keep the Sabbath, which for them means no electricity, no phones, no cars, just staying in the neighborhood, to eat only their specific food, to marry within the group or bring someone in. That level of intentionality is what creates such a dense, resilient social fabric.
It makes me wonder what other legacy systems are out there in the world that we are just ignoring because they do not fit the modern narrative of progress. We are so focused on the next big thing that we forget that the oldest things are often the ones that have been the most thoroughly tested.
That is the Lindy effect in action. The longer something has lasted, the longer it is likely to continue lasting. The Samaritans are the ultimate Lindy culture. They have survived for 2,500 years, which gives them a much better statistical chance of surviving another 1,000 than any modern political movement or social trend that has only been around for a decade or two.
It is a humbling thought. We think we are so advanced with our digital world and our global connectivity, but we are just a blip compared to the timeline they are operating on. They are playing the long game.
Truly, it really puts things in perspective. Well, I think we have given people plenty to chew on today.
Definitely. Let us wrap it up there. Thanks again for the prompt, Daniel. And thanks to all of you for listening. We will catch you in the next one.
Goodbye for now.
One last thing, Herman. I was thinking about the script differences again. You mentioned the Ten Commandments. Is it true that the Samaritan version combines the first two commandments into one, so they can make room for the commandment about Mount Gerizim?
Yes, that is exactly how they do it. In the Jewish and Christian traditions, the first commandment is often seen as, I am the Lord your God, and the second is, you shall have no other gods. The Samaritans count those as a single commandment, which keeps the total at 10 even after they add the instruction to build the altar on Gerizim. It is a very clever bit of textual engineering to maintain the sacred number 10 while including their central geographic requirement.
It is like they found a way to refactor the code without changing the external interface. The Ten Commandments brand stays the same, but the internal logic is updated to support their specific architecture. It is brilliant, really.
Precisely. It is all about maintaining that consistency. Anyway, we could talk about this for hours, but we should probably let the listeners get on with their day.
Fair enough. See you next time, Herman.
See you, Corn.
And remember, everyone, check out myweirdprompts.com for the full archive. There is so much more to explore.
Signing off for real this time. Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.